The Texas Panhandle, October 1874. Tabecho counted the horses twice before she believed the number, and then she sat down in the burned grass and did not get up for a while. 11. Out of what had been, 4 days earlier, something over 140 head standing, picketed and hobbled along a mile of Tool Creek, the good buffalo horses, the war horses, the pack string, the colts that were not yet old enough to carry anything at all and had been kept only because a colt becomes a horse if you are patient, and patience had been the one thing that country had always given them in return for very little. The soldiers had come down into the canyon at first light on the 28th of September, off a trail that should not have existed, through a break in the caprock that the people had used for 3 lifetimes and had believed, wrongly, that no one else knew. There had been almost no fighting. That was the strange and terrible thing about it, the thing Tabecho turned over for the rest of her life. A village of Quahati and Kiowa and Cheyenne lodges strung for 4 miles along the floor of Palo Duro Canyon, more than 1,000 souls, had come apart in about 20 minutes because the soldiers had not come for the people. They had come for the horses. They took what they could drive, and they shot the rest. It took most of a day. Tabecho had not seen it. She had been up on the rim by then with her children and her husband's mother in the rocks, watching lodges burn 1,000 feet below. But she had heard it hour after hour, a sound with no pattern to it and no end, and some of the old people said afterward that it was the worst sound any of them had ever heard in a life that had not been short of terrible sounds. Worse than gunfire in a fight because there was no answering it, because it went on so long, because a horse screams like nothing else screams. 1,400 head by the count that went up and down the canyon in the weeks after. Some said more. The soldiers kept perhaps 300 for their own use and drove the rest, more than 1,000, into a corral of ropes at the mouth of the canyon and shot them there over 2 days, because there was no way to feed that many animals on a march back to the fort and no intention whatsoever of leaving them for the people to recover. A horse is not property in the way a white man means the word when he writes it in a ledger. Tabecho had tried twice in her life to explain this to white men who were in a position to matter, and had given it up both times as a waste of breath that she could not afford to waste. A horse was the difference between a family that ate in December and a family that did not. A horse was how you followed the herd, and the herd was how you ate the rest of the year, and a woman without a horse to carry meat and hide off the killing ground might as well not have made the kill at all, because she could not get it home. And a horse was also, less usefully but no less truly, the thing a man was buried remembering. Tabecho's husband, Black Otter, had bred the gray stud that was among the 11 survivors from a mare his own father had given him as a boy, and he had died 9 days before Palo Duro in a running fight with cavalry along the Sweetwater, protecting exactly nothing that could be pointed to now. A small horse herd that had been taken anyway 3 weeks later in the canyon, along with everything else. He was 31 years old. Tabecho was 29. She had 2 children and a mother-in-law with a hip that had never set right after a fall in 1868, and 11 horses among perhaps 40 people who had scattered west and south out of the canyon in small groups because 1,000 souls moving together left a trail a blind man could follow, and 100 small groups did not. 11, said Owl Woman, coming up slowly behind her on the bad hip, using a lance for a staff the way she had for 6 years now. You have counted them twice. I watched you. I wanted to be sure before I said it to anybody. You are sure? Say it to me first, since I am the one who is going to have to decide what we do with the number, being the oldest fool in this camp. Owl Woman lowered herself onto a rock with the particular care of a woman whose bones had opinions about weather. 11 horses and 40 people, say the rest of it. 4 of the 11 are colts too young to carry a load. 2 of the mares are in foal and should not carry a load either. Not in this cold, not this far along. That leaves 5 horses that can work for 40 people and everything 40 people own going into the moon. When the leaves fall, with the grass already going and no meat put up because there was no time to put up meat. How much meat is there? None, said Tabecho. There is what people are carrying on their backs from the summer hunt, and it is not much because the herds this year were thin and scattered wrong, and everyone knows why. Everyone did know why, and it did not need saying between the two of them, though it got said at councils that autumn until the words wore smooth, that the great herds which had covered that country from horizon to horizon within living memory had been going for 6 or 7 years under the guns of white hide hunters who killed for the skin alone and left the meat to rot in windrows that a man could walk on top of for a mile without his feet touching ground, and that a numunu hunter riding out in the moon of ripe plums in 1874 had ridden 2 days past dead buffalo, skinned and left, before he found one worth the powder to kill it living. That was the thing that had put Isatai and the war pipe in every camp on that plain that spring, before adobe walls, before any of the rest of it, not pride, arithmetic. The hide men were killing the food faster than the food could be eaten, purely to strip the skin off it and ship the skin east, and a people who had built an entire life around a herd that renewed itself every year without asking anything of anyone had watched that renewal be murdered on a scale that made no sense to them, because it made no sense, because it was not hunting, it was industry. And nobody on that plain in 1874 had a word yet for what industry was going to do to a country. "I am not going to pretend the buffalo will come back in this," said Owl Woman, as if she had heard the whole of that thought pass across her daughter-in-law's face, which she probably had, having watched it pass across a great many faces over 61 years. "That fight is over, and we lost it before we understood we were in it. What I want from you now is the winter. 5 horses, 40 people. What do we do?" Tabecho looked out over 11 horses standing head down and hip-shot in burned grass under a sky that had gone the flat white color that meant, in that country, that it intended to get much colder before it intended anything else. "We do the thing my grandmother did in the hungry winter," she said finally. "We split small, and we go where the wood is, and we make every one of those horses do the work of 2, and we start now, today, because every day we sit here talking is a day closer to the ground freezing hard enough that we cannot dig a root out of it. And the children who cannot walk that far, they ride. The horses carry children and hides and nothing else, and everyone who can walk, walks, starting with me." Owl Woman nodded slowly and got up off the rock, testing the hip before she trusted it with her weight, the way she tested everything now before she trusted it. "Then walk," she said. "I will tell the others what you have decided, and I will tell it as though it was decided in council by wiser heads than yours, because a young widow telling 40 frightened people what to do is a young widow who gets argued with, and an old woman repeating a decision as settled fact is an old woman who gets obeyed. That is the whole of what I am still useful for at my age, and I intend to get the last good use out of it." They went west and then south in a group that shrank to 29 people within the first 4 days as families peeled off toward relations they hoped were still alive in other bands, and Tabecho's group by the second week of October was down to 11 souls. Herself and her 2 children, Owl Woman, her husband's younger brother Standing Crow, and his wife and their infant, and 4 old people who had no one else and had attached themselves to Owl Woman the way old people without family attach themselves to whoever is still troubling to count heads at night. Her children were Foxtail, who was 12, and Blue Flower, who was 7. Foxtail had been at Palo Duro on the rim with the women and the old men, which was where boys his age belonged, and where he had spent the whole of the fighting in a state of fury at being kept there, and in the 5 weeks since he had said almost nothing about his father and a great deal at every opportunity about the 11 horses and what he intended to do about the men who had shot the rest of them. He had a bow that had been his father's, cut down to his size by his father 2 winters before, and he had begun, without being asked, to stand first watch every night whether it was his turn or not. And Tabecho watched her son turning 12 years old into something harder and older in the space of a season, and did not know how to stop it, and was not entirely sure in her worst hours that she wanted to. Blue Flower asked on the 9th day, riding double behind her mother on the gray stud that had been her father's. whether they were going to starve. Tabecho had thought about how she would answer that question for 2 days before it was asked, because she had known it was coming, the way you know weather is coming from the color at the edge of the sky. "We are going to be hungry," she said. "There is a difference between hungry and starving, and I want you to learn it now, because you are going to need it more than once before you are grown. Hungry is a thing your body does. Starving is a thing that happens when hungry goes on long enough without anyone doing anything about it. I am doing something about it every day. That is the whole of my work right now, and it is going to stay my work until the grass comes back, and I need you to trust that it is being done even on the days it does not look like enough." "Is it enough?" "I do not know yet," said her mother, because Owl Woman had also taught her, a long time before, that a lie a child catches you in once is a lie that costs you every true thing you say afterward. "I know that not knowing is not the same as doing nothing, and I know that I have not stopped either one since your father died, and I am not going to start." The 11 horses did the work of 30 for 6 weeks, and it broke 2 of them doing it, and it very nearly broke Tabecho, whose feet by the middle of November had gone through 3 pairs of moccasins, and had reached the stage of walking where a person stops feeling the cold in them and starts instead to feel nothing at all, which every old person in that camp told her, with real alarm, was worse. They ate what there was. In the first 2 weeks, that meant the dried meat and pemmican people had carried out of the canyon on their own backs, portioned by Owl Woman with a precision that verged on cruelty, and that kept 11 people fed for 19 days on what should by rights have fed 6 for that long. After that, it meant whatever the country gave up, the last of the wild plums shriveled on the branch, and better for it, sweeter, a sourness gone out of them with the frost. Prairie turnips, dug with a fire-hardened stick from ground that fought back harder every week as the freeze went deeper. A badger that Foxtail killed with a thrown stone on the 11th day of November, and that Owl Woman rendered down to the last scrap of fat, because fat in that season was worth more than meat. Fat was what kept a body's fire lit through a night at 10 below, and a person who had eaten lean meat all winter, and no fat, could starve to death on a full stomach, which was a thing Tabecho had watched happen once in the hungry winter of 1867 to a man twice her size. Standing Crow found buffalo sign twice and lost it both times, once to a norther that scoured every track off the plain in 4 hours, and once because the sign belonged to 11 animals moving fast, spooked, driven by something, and 11 animals were not worth 2 days' travel away from the wood and water they already had. What they had, mostly going into December, was rabbit, taken in snares that Owl Woman had been setting since before Tabecho was born, in a pattern of loops along brush lines that looked to an untrained eye like nothing at all, and to Owl Woman's eye like a map of exactly where a frightened animal would choose to run. "You are going to have to know all of this," the old woman said to Blue Flower one evening, checking a line of 11 snares, with the girl trailing behind her with a bag for whatever they found. 3 rabbits and a 4th snare, sprung and empty, the string chewed through by something that had gotten there first. "Not because I am tired, though I am tired, because there may come a winter when there is no one left who knows it, and I would rather that not be your winter." "Why would there be no one left who knows it?" "Because the ones who know it are old," said Owl Woman, "and the world we learned it in is going faster than I would have believed possible, faster than anyone believed possible in the year I was your age. And a girl who only knows how to be given things by a mother and a grandmother is a girl who will be in serious trouble the first winter neither of us is there to give them." She reset the sprung snare with hands that did not shake, though everything else about her by December had begun to. "So, show me you can tie it, not tell me." "Show me." Blue Flower tied it wrong twice and right the 3rd time, and Owl Woman said nothing at all, which from Owl Woman was the highest praise available. On the 2nd of December, they came down out of the breaks onto a shallow creek that Owl Woman said had held water and wood every winter of her life, and found both, and found also, half a mile upstream, in the lee of a cut bank, the ashes of a fire 4 or 5 days cold, and beside it, a single set of tracks belonging to a man on foot alone, wearing government-issue boots with a worn heel that dragged slightly on the left side, walking in a direction that made no sense at all for a soldier or a hide hunter or a rancher, which was north and east, back the way an army column would have come from, alone, in December, on foot, with no horse, and, so far as the sign showed, very little else. Foxtail wanted to follow the tracks that same afternoon. Standing Crow wanted to leave the creek entirely and put 10 miles between the camp and whatever that fire meant before dark. Owl Woman, who had knelt over the ashes longer than anyone else and had put her hand into them to gauge the last of the heat, said neither. "Government boots," she said, "on a man walking alone away from where the government soldiers are at this time of year with no horse, and, by the depth of these prints, not much of a pack. That is not a soldier deserting toward home. A soldier deserting goes toward a town, toward a railroad, toward anything with a roof on it. This man is walking into the breaks in December with nothing, and there are only 2 kinds of men who do that." "What are they?" said Tabecho. "A man who has decided to die," said Owl Woman, "and a man who has decided he no longer belongs anywhere he has been, and is looking for somewhere he might." She stood up slowly, testing the hip. "I do not know which this one is. I know we stay here tonight regardless because the wood and the water are good, and I am not walking 10 more miles on this leg for the sake of a single set of tracks going away from us, not toward us. If he comes back, we will find out then which kind of man he is." Foxtail, at 12, already carrying a great deal more anger than a boy that age should have to carry, and not yet skilled at setting any of it down, said, "If he comes back, I am going to kill him." "You are not," said his grandmother, without heat in the tone she used for facts rather than the tone she used for arguments, "because you have never killed a man in your life, and the first one you kill should not be a starving stranger walking alone in the snow for reasons you do not yet know, or you will spend the rest of your life the way I have watched other boys spend it, unable to stop asking themselves what those reasons were." She looked at her grandson for a long moment. "You want it to be simple. It is going to be a very long time, if ever, before anything is simple again. I am sorry for that. It is also true." He came back on the 4th night, into the firelight, with his hands well away from his sides and a rabbit already skinned and quartered held out in front of him on a piece of bark like a man presenting a paper he expects to be shot for handing over. He was perhaps 40, and he was not a soldier, though he wore the boots and the wool trousers of one, gone ragged at the cuff and patched at the knee with a piece of blanket. He was not Quahati and not Kiowa and not Cheyenne, and Tabecho knew what he was within about 4 seconds of the firelight finding his face, because there was no mistaking a Tonkawa, not in that country, not for a Numunu woman who had grown up hearing what the old people said about them. And the whole camp came up onto its feet at once, and Standing Crow had a knife in his hand before the man had finished lowering the rabbit to the ground. "I am not armed," the man said in Comanche, badly but comprehensibly, the accent wrong in a way that told her he had learned it as an adult, from soldiers or from captives, not at a mother's knee. "I have been at your fire 3 times since you camped here, and I have taken nothing from it, and I have left this each time and gone before light, and I am telling you that now, instead of letting you find out, because a man found out is a man who gets killed before anyone asks him anything." "Tonkawa," said Standing Crow, and it was not a greeting. "Yes, Scout." The man did not answer that one immediately, and the not answering was its own answer, and Tabecho watched her brother-in-law's knuckles go white around the knife handle. "Was," the man said finally. "I was a scout for the soldiers at Fort Sill and before that at Fort Griffin 9 years. I walked away from the column on the 10th of October, and I have not gone back, and I do not intend to." "Why not?" said Owl Woman, who alone in that firelight had not moved. had not reached for anything and was looking at the stranger with the particular unhurried attention she gave to weather that had not yet decided what it was going to do. "That is a long answer, grandmother, and I do not think this is the night for it, with a knife 3 feet from my chest." "It is exactly the night for it," said Owl Woman, "because it is the only night you are going to get a room full of people who have not yet decided to kill you. Once we decide, the conversation is finished. Talk now or do not talk at all." So he told them, standing in firelight with his hands still spread, in the same halting, deliberate Comanche, stopping sometimes to find a word and using the wrong one twice, and correcting himself both times without embarrassment, like a man for whom being wrong in front of strangers had long since stopped costing him anything he still had left to lose. His name among the soldiers was Sam. His people had called him something else, a long time ago, before there was almost no one left of his people to call him anything at all. He had been 8 years old on the night in October of 1862 when a mixed party of Comanche, Kiowa, and Caddo and Tabecho felt the fire go out of her own chest for a moment at the sound of her own people's name inside this man's grief, came into the Tonkawa camp on the Washita in Indian Territory before dawn and killed, by the count that was made afterward and that nobody ever fully trusted because there was no one left in a position to count carefully, somewhere between a third and half of the entire Tonkawa nation in about 2 hours. His mother, his father, 2 sisters, one of them younger than Blue Flower was now. He had survived because an ant had thrown him into a ravine and lain on top of him and had herself been killed doing it, and he had lain under her body until the shooting stopped, and then for a long time after, not because he was hiding anymore, but because he did not, at 8 years old, know how to make his legs work. "I am not telling you this to make you sorry," he said when Standing Crow made a sound of contempt at the self-pity of it. "I am telling you because it is the reason for everything that comes after, and if I do not tell it you will fill in the reason with something worse, which people always do, and it usually is worse. But in my case it happens to be true that the worst thing anyone ever did to me was done partly by people who looked like you, and I want that said out loud between us before I say the rest, because the rest is going to sound like an excuse otherwise, and it is not one." He had been taken in after by what remained of his people, scattered and diminished and living for years afterward under the protection of soldiers at whatever fort would tolerate them, because a Tonkawa man in that country, after 1862, who was not under some soldier's protection did not, as a rule, live very long, the old grudges having grown teeth of their own by then that had nothing to do with the original grudge at all. And he had scouted for the army because the army fed the survivors of his people when almost no one else on that plain would, and because a Tonkawa boy who grew into a Tonkawa man in that world learned to track and read country and read weather the way any child of that plain learned it, out of necessity, and the army paid a man for a skill it would otherwise have gotten for nothing off a corpse. "And Palo Duro," said Owl Woman. The fire popped. Nobody in that camp breathed for what felt like a long time. "I found the trail into the canyon," said Sam. "I am not going to tell you I did not, because you would find out I had lied within the week from some other mouth, and then nothing else I say tonight or ever again will mean anything to you. I found it on the 26th of September, and I told Colonel Mackenzie's officers where it was on the 27th, and the column went down it at first light on the 28th, and I was 300 yards behind the point when the shooting started, and I have not been the same man since that morning, and I do not expect to be again." Standing Crow's wife made a small broken sound, thinking, Tabecho understood a beat later, of her own family's horses, of the 11 that were left. "You led them to the horses," said Foxtail. It was the first thing the boy had said all evening, and his voice cracked on it, 12 years old, trying to sound like a man and getting halfway there. "I led them to the canyon," said Sam, and looked at the boy directly, which cost him something visible to do. "I did not know, when I told them where the trail was, that it would end the way it ended. I want that to be true more than I have wanted almost anything else in my life, and I have gone over it every night since the 28th of September, trying to find the place where I could have known and stopped myself, and I cannot find it. And I do not know anymore whether that means I am innocent or whether it means I simply was not paying close enough attention to my own conscience at the time, and both of those are still possible, and I have stopped being sure which one is true. That is not an answer, said Foxtail. No, agreed Sam. It is not. I do not have one. I have been looking for one on foot in the snow for 6 weeks, and I have not found it, and I am not going to insult you by pretending I have found it tonight in order to make this conversation end sooner. They did not kill him that night, and it was Owl Woman's doing, though she never once said so directly and let the others believe, as she had intended them to, that the decision had somehow made itself. What she said was, "He is one man on foot with no weapon he has shown us, and no horse, in a country where we cannot spare the strength to guard a prisoner, and cannot spare the conscience to kill an unarmed man who walked into our fire to confess instead of walking away to hide, which is the choice available to him and which he did not take. Tie nothing. Watch him tonight the way you would watch anyone. In the morning we will decide what we are, because right now we are simply 40 people, 11 of them here, trying to live through December, and I do not have room in me tonight for anything larger than that." He slept, or did not sleep, sitting upright against a cottonwood at the edge of the firelight, with Standing Crow's knife hand a few feet away all night, and Foxtail's eyes on him for most of it, and in the gray of the morning he was still there, which by itself changed something in the camp that nothing said the night before had changed, because a man who could have walked off into the dark at 2 in the morning and did not was a man who had, in some fashion nobody there yet trusted, decided to stay and be judged. Tabecho found him at first light, rebuilding the fire that had gone down to coals, doing it competently, with the particular economy of a man who has built a great many fires in a great many winters and has stopped wasting motion on it. "Why did you come to this fire and not another?" she said. "There must be other camps scattered out of that canyon. Why ours?" "I did not choose yours," said Sam. "I have been walking in circles for 6 weeks with no particular destination because I discovered, on about the 3rd day, that I did not actually know where I was walking to, only what I was walking away from, and a man who only knows what he is fleeing eventually stops moving in a straight line at all. This is the first fire I have come across in 9 days. And what do you want from it?" He considered the question with what seemed to Tabecho like real care, turning a piece of cottonwood over in his hands before he set it on the coals. "I do not know that I want anything," he said. "I have brought meat to this fire 3 nights because I had meat and you did not, and it seemed to me the only thing I still knew how to do that was not, in some fashion, part of the problem. I am not asking you to forgive anything. I do not think there is a version of what I did that gets forgiven, and I would distrust anyone who offered it easily. I am asking whether there is work near a fire for a man who can hunt and track and read weather, and does not, at the moment, have anywhere else in the entire world that would have him." Tabecho looked at him for a long moment in the gray light and thought about 11 horses, and a badger rendered down to its last scrap of fat, and a boy of 12 standing first watch every night that was not his turn, and a daughter of 7 who had learned to tie a snare on the 3rd try, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her afterward when she remembered it, that she did not have room left in her for hatred that did not also feed somebody. "You can track," she said. It was not quite a question. "I can track anything that has walked on this plain in the last 3 days, in most weather, and I have found buffalo sign at greater distances than any 3 men I scouted with, which is not pride. It is simply the thing I am for, the way another man is for hides or for horses. Standing Crow has found sign twice and lost it twice. I would not have lost it," said Sam, without any boast in his voice at all, only the flat statement of a fact he had tested many times and found reliable. "That is not an insult to your brother-in-law. It is a different skill, and I have spent 9 years doing nothing else." Owl Woman, who had come up without either of them noticing, said from a few feet away, in the voice she used for settled facts, "Then that is your work, if you want it, and you will do it under watch until you have earned otherwise. And the day you bring this camp meat that keeps a child alive who would not have lived without it, we will begin to have a conversation about the rest of what you have done, not before. Do you understand the difference between what I am offering and forgiveness? Yes, grandmother. Say it back to me so I know you understand it and are not simply agreeing to make me stop talking. You are offering me a way to be useful, said Sam, in exchange for watching and not in exchange for anything being forgotten. Good, said Owl Woman. Then go and be useful. There is a boy over there who has not slept properly since October and who is going to hate you for a long time, regardless of anything you do, and I would like you to find that buffalo sign before the cold gets much worse, because I am 61 years old, and I would like to eat fat again before I die of being righteous about a man I have not yet decided whether to trust. And that, more than anything either of them had said the night before, was the thing that decided it, because it made the whole terrible business of the last 6 weeks into something that could, provisionally, be lived inside of one more day, which was the only kind of decision that camp had the strength to make about anything, that winter or for a long while after. He found the buffalo on the 9th day, 11 miles to the southwest, a scattered remnant band of perhaps 30 animals holed up in a breaks country so broken and so poor in grass that no hide hunter had yet troubled to ride into it, and it took the camp's 5 sound horses and every able adult 2 full days to make the kill and butcher it and get the meat home, and it was, by any honest measure, the difference between that winter and the winter of 1867 that Tabecho had told her daughter about without details. Sam did not go in on the kill itself. He had said before they left that a Tonkawa on a hunt with Numunu hunters who had known him 4 days was a dead Tonkawa waiting for an excuse, and that he would rather stay at the fire with the old people and be useful there than give anyone an excuse in a moment when tempers and rifles were both close to hand. Owl Woman had not argued with him about it, which told Tabecho something about how closely the old woman had already come to the same conclusion herself. What he did instead, while the hunters were gone, was Dr. Standing Crow's wife's infant, who had come down with a rattling cough in the chest 2 days before that had everyone in camp frightened without saying so. Using a preparation of skunk fat and a root Tabecho did not recognize that he dug himself from under 3 inches of frozen ground with a knife, working for most of an hour on his knees in the cold to get at it. "Where did you learn that?" Owl Woman asked him, watching him work the fat into the child's chest with hands that were, Tabecho noticed for the first time, careful in a way that did not match the rest of what she had been told about him. "From your people, grandmother, though I do not think you would want to hear it that way," said Sam. "I scouted 8 years alongside interpreters and captives and old women who had been taken young by one tribe or another and had carried what they knew with them wherever they ended up. And I asked questions, because a scout who only knows how to find a trail and does not know how to keep the people following it alive is only half a scout, and I have buried enough men on marches to have decided, a long time ago, to learn the other half." The infant's cough eased by the second night. Nobody in that camp said thank you to him in words, not yet, but Standing Crow's wife began, from that week on, to set his portion of whatever there was to eat without being asked, in the same unremarked way she set anyone else's, and in that country, in that season, that was a louder statement than any speech. They moved on the 14th of December, southeast toward the Wichita country, because word had come by a family passing through. Word travels on an empty plain the way it travels nowhere else, carried faster than any rider could carry it by people who had nothing left to do but talk, that there were bands gathering near the agency at Fort Sill who had decided or were close to deciding that the fighting was finished, that there was no way to feed a family through another winter like this one on a country that had neither buffalo nor horses left in it in the numbers a free life required, and that the agency, whatever its cruelties, had flour. It was not a decision Tabecho had let herself think about directly until she heard other people saying it out loud, because to think about it directly was to think about the whole shape of the rest of her life changing, and she had been rationing her own strength too carefully for 2 months to spend any of it on grief for a way of living that was not yet technically over. But she thought about it now, walking, with Blue Flower asleep against her back and the gray stud carrying 2 old people and a load of buffalo hide that would be the difference between a lodge and no lodge come spring, and what she thought was not despair exactly, though despair was in it somewhere. What she thought was arithmetic, the same cold arithmetic Owl Woman had taught her to do with horses and pounds and days, applied now to a much larger and much worse sum, that 140 horses had become 11, that a herd that had covered that country from horizon to horizon within her own mother's memory had become 30 animals hiding in country too poor for even the hide men to bother with, that the fight, if it was still a fight, was being fought now entirely with children's lives as the stake, and that she did not have the right, whatever she had a right to feel, to spend her children on a war that the country itself had already decided. "You are thinking about the agency," said Owl Woman, walking beside her on the bad hip, matching her pace to Tabecho's without seeming to try. "I am thinking about whether thinking about it makes me a coward." "It does not," said Owl Woman. "I want to tell you a thing my own mother told me. In a year I will not name because it does not matter which year. It only matters that it was a bad one. She said, there is a kind of bravery that means walking toward the thing that frightens you, and there is a kind that means walking toward the thing that will keep your children breathing, even though everyone, including yourself, will call it surrender. And the second kind gets you no songs and no stories and no old men nodding at your name around a fire, and it is very often the harder of the two. And it is not less brave for being unsung. I have watched you do the second kind since October without one single day off from it. Nobody is going to write a song about the 11 horses and the badger fat and the snares you taught your daughter. And I want you to hear, from someone who has been alive a long time and has buried more than she has kept, that the songs were always about the wrong things." Tabecho did not answer that for a long while, walking. "What does he think?" she said at last, meaning Sam, who was scouting a quarter-mile ahead of the column, alone, the way he had walked every day since the buffalo kill, close enough to be useful and far enough that no one had to decide, each hour, all over again, whether they could stand to have him near. "I have not asked him," said Owl Woman, "because it is not his decision, and he knows it is not his decision, which is one of perhaps 3 things about that man I have come to trust in 12 days, and I do not intend to spend any of that trust asking him a question that would put the decision back in his hands, even for a moment. Do you trust him?" "I trust that he has told us the truth about himself, including the parts that would have gone easier for him unsaid," said Owl Woman. "That is not the same thing as trusting a man entirely, and I have lived 61 years without confusing the two, and I would advise you to learn the difference faster than 61 years, because I think you are going to need it sooner than I needed it." The conflict, when it came, did not come from outside the camp at all, though for 2 days everyone had been braced for it to come from Sam's own former employers, from a cavalry patrol, from a ranger company, from any of the dozen shapes that danger had worn all autumn. It came instead from 4 young men riding hard out of the southeast on the 16th of December on horses that were themselves half-starved from what remained of a Kiowa band that had lost, among a great many other things in that terrible year, a cousin of one of the 4 at Palo Duro, shot from his horse in the retreat off the canyon rim while the herds were being taken. They had heard, from the same traveling grapevine that carried everything on that plain, that there was a Tonkawa scout walking free in a Quahati camp 11 days south, and they had ridden 2 days on half-starved horses to do something about it, and the leader of the 4, a young man named Standing in the Timber who could not have been more than 19, rode into that camp at a dead run with a rifle already up. What happened next took perhaps 90 seconds, and Tabecho relived it in fragments for years. Sam did not run. That was the first thing, and it was the thing that Foxtail, standing 8 feet away with his father's cut-down bow already strung, said afterward he had not expected and could not explain, because everything the boy had been taught to believe about a scout, about a Tonkawa, about a man who had led soldiers into a canyon, was that such a man would run the instant running became possible. And Sam instead stepped forward into the open, away from the lodges, putting distance between the threat and the children, which was either the bravest thing Tabecho had ever watched a man do, or the most calculated, and she was never afterward entirely sure which, and came eventually to believe it did not matter which, that the two things had simply, in that particular man, stopped being different from each other. "I am not going to run from you," Sam said in Comanche, loud enough for the whole camp to hear, his hands spread the same way they had been spread at the fire 12 days before. "I know why you have come, and I am not going to pretend I do not deserve some part of what you intend, but there are children behind me, and I would ask you to put the rifle down until they are out of the line of it, and then you may do whatever this camp decides is owed." "This camp does not decide anything about you," said Standing in the Timber. "You are Tonkawa. There is no camp on this plain with authority to protect you from what your people have earned 12 times over." And it was Owl Woman, 61 years old, on a bad hip, with no weapon in her hand at all, who walked out in front of Sam, between him and the rifle, close enough that Standing in the Timber would have had to put a bullet through an old woman's body to reach the man behind her, and said in a voice that did not shake, though Tabecho, watching, was shaking badly enough for both of them, "You will have to decide right now, in front of children, whether you are the kind of man who shoots an old woman to get at the man standing behind her. I have watched that decision made twice in my life by other young men in other bad years, and I want to tell you, before you make it, that both of those men spent the rest of their lives being the man who made it, and neither of them, so far as I ever learned, found that a comfortable thing to be." Standing in the Timber did not lower the rifle for a long, terrible interval, and in that interval Tabecho did the only thing left to do, which was to step out beside her mother-in-law, and then Standing Crow stepped out beside her, and then, to everyone's evident surprise, including his own, Foxtail, 12 years old, stood in front of the man he had said 9 days before he intended to kill, with his father's bow still in his hand and his knees visibly not steady, and said nothing at all because he did not yet have words for what he was doing and did it anyway. "He is under this camp's watch," said Owl Woman. "Not this camp's forgiveness. I want that said plainly, because I do not offer forgiveness on anyone's behalf but my own, and I have not decided whether I offer it on that behalf either. He is under our watch, and a man under a camp's watch is that camp's business and no one else's, and if you have a grievance with how this camp is conducting its business, you may bring it to a council fire like a person, or you may shoot an old woman in front of her own grandson, and I am telling you that the second thing is the only way you are getting to him today." It was Foxtail, in the end, who broke it, though nobody who was there ever fully agreed afterward on how to describe what he did. He said, to Standing in the Timber, in a voice that cracked twice in one short sentence, "He found the buffalo that fed my sister. I have not forgiven him for anything, and I am not asking you to. But I am the one whose horses were shot, and I am the one who gets to say whether this is finished, and I say it is not finished, but it is not finished today, and not by you." Standing in the Timber looked at the boy for a long moment, and then at the 4 adults standing in front of him, and then slowly lowered the rifle. "This is not over," he said. "No," agreed Owl Woman. "It is not, and I have not asked it to be, and I will not insult your cousin's memory by pretending a debt like that closes in 12 days. I am only telling you that it does not close today in front of children, on a horse that is too tired to carry you home if you have to run from what you have done here. Go and eat something, all 4 of you, because I can see your ribs from here, and go home, and if you want to bring this to a council fire in the spring, when there are elders enough gathered to hear it properly, I will stand at that fire myself and say everything I know, on both sides of it, and let it be decided the way such things are supposed to be decided, instead of on a morning like this one." They did not eat. They rode off within the hour, having said what they came to say, and having, in some fashion that Tabecho did not fully understand until much later, gotten it, because the point had never entirely been to kill him, not for all four of them, and having been made to stand in front of a camp of exhausted, half-starved people and see the actual shape of what they were about to do had done something to at least two of the four that the ride south had not prepared them for. But Foxtail sat down hard on the frozen ground the moment they were out of sight and put his face in his hands and shook for a long time, and it was Sam, not his mother, not his grandmother, who crouched down a few feet away, not touching him, and said quietly in the halting Comanche that had gotten better in 12 days, "You did not have to do that." "I know," said Foxtail into his hands. "I do not know why you did it." "Neither do I," said the boy. And that, Tabecho thought, watching from a few feet away with her own hands not steady, was probably the truest thing either of them had said to each other yet, and the beginning, though none of them could have named it as that on the day it happened, of something that eventually became almost trust. They spent the worst of the cold, from Christmas until the middle of February, in a sheltered draw of the Wichita breaks that Sam found for them. And it was there, in the flattest and hungriest stretch of that whole terrible winter, that Tabecho and Sam settled into the working shape that eventually became the rest of both their lives, though neither of them called it that yet and would have been startled, in January, to hear it named. It was practical from the first day, and it stayed practical, and that was, Tabecho came to believe, the only way it could have started at all. He hunted. She and the other women dressed what he brought and made it last 3 times as long as it would have lasted eaten carelessly. He read weather 2 days out with an accuracy that saved them, on one occasion, from a norther that would have caught them exposed on open ground. She read people, read which of the 4 old people needed to be given the choice piece of fat before they would admit to needing it, read which of the 2 young wives was closer to giving up than she was saying, read, better than he ever quite managed, the exact moment a decision needed to be made before it curdled into a crisis. They did not speak of anything beyond the day's work for most of 6 weeks, and Tabecho was, if she was honest with herself in the few private minutes a day afforded her, glad of it, because the shape of her grief for Black Otter had not yet found its edges, and she did not trust herself to know the difference, in that state, between gratitude and something else that would have been, in that season, both dishonest and unwise. What changed it in the end was not a conversation. It was a morning in late January when Blue Flower, 7 years old, sat down beside Sam at the fire without being told to and without asking permission, and held out her small, cold hands to be warmed the way she had once held them out to her father, and Sam went very still for a long moment, and then, carefully, as though handling something that might break in either direction, took the child's hands in his and rubbed warmth into them, and said nothing at all, and Tabecho, watching from across the fire, felt something in her chest that she did not yet have a name for and did not examine closely enough that week to find one. Owl Woman noticed it too, because Owl Woman noticed everything, and said that same evening to no one in particular, in the tone she used for weather, "A child does not warm her hands at a fire she is afraid of. Children are more honest about this than any of the rest of us have the courage to be." "I am not asking you to approve of anything," said Tabecho, sharper than she intended. "I did not offer approval," said Owl Woman. "I offered an observation about a child's hands. You are the one who heard a question in it which tells me something you have not yet told yourself. The decision to go into the agency was made, in the end, the way most of the great decisions of that terrible year were made. Not in a single dramatic council, but in 100 small ones, family by family, as word kept arriving that the last of the free bands were coming in through the spring. That Quahati, under leaders whose names traveled the plain like weather reports, were talking seriously at last of ending it. That there was flour and beef at the agency for those who surrendered their arms and their horses, such horses as remained, and that a country with no buffalo in it and precious few horses left to hunt, what little buffalo remained, was not, whatever else it was, a country a person could raise children in on pride alone. Tabecho made the decision in March, on a day she remembered afterward with total clarity, because it was the day the first real thaw came, and she stood in mud to her ankles for the first time in 4 months and felt something in her that she recognized with something like alarm as relief rather than defeat. "We are going in," she told Owl Woman. "I know," said the old woman. "I have known for a week. I was waiting to see how long it would take you to say it out loud, because I have found that a decision said out loud costs a person something different than a decision merely arrived at, and I wanted you to pay that cost yourself instead of me paying it for you by guessing. Are you angry? I am 71 years from the day my own mother made a very similar decision in a very similar spring," said Owl Woman, which was not strictly an answer, and which Tabecho understood over the years to have been the truest answer available. "I have watched this exact arithmetic get done by exhausted women in bad country more times than I want to count, going back to when I was a girl younger than Blue Flower is now, and every single time, the ones who did the arithmetic honestly and did not let pride do it for them were the ones whose children were still alive 5 years later to resent them for it. Let your children resent you in 5 years for having gone in. It is a better thing to be resented for than the alternative, and I say that as a woman with a great deal of practice at both. The question of Sam took longer, and it was, in its way, harder, because going into the agency meant going into exactly the authority he had spent 9 years serving and had then walked away from without permission, and nobody in that small camp, including Sam himself, was entirely certain what would happen to a Tonkawa scout who reappeared at Fort Sill having deserted his post 6 months before in the direct aftermath of the very campaign he had helped guide. "I could be shot for desertion," he said to Tabecho plainly, the night before they broke camp for the agency, the two of them sitting a little apart from the fire in the particular quiet that had grown up between them over 3 months of shared unspoken work, or simply arrested and held, or, and this is the outcome I think most likely, entirely forgotten, because the Army does not, in my experience, spend a great deal of energy chasing a scout who was never really one of its own men to begin with, and there is a decent chance no one in a position to care has noticed I am gone at all. And if it is the first thing, then it is the first thing, said Sam, and I will have earned a good deal worse than a bullet from a good deal of directions this year. And I am not going to ask this camp to change its plans on my account. You have children. Go in. I will follow at a distance and take my chances separately, and if it goes badly for me, it will not be the first time the world has decided something badly for a Tonkawa, and it will not, God knows, be the last." Tabecho was quiet for a long time, looking at the fire. "I am going to say something," she said finally, "and I want you to hear the whole of it before you decide what it means, because I have thought about how to say it for longer than is probably good for me." "Say it." "I do not forgive you for the canyon," said Tabecho. "I want that said first and said plainly, because I think you would rather hear it plainly than have it softened, and because it is still true, and I do not know if it will ever stop being true, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make either of us more comfortable tonight. I would rather hear it plainly. Thank you. And I have watched you for 3 months do more to keep this camp's children alive than any single other person in it, including myself," she went on. "And I have watched my son stand in front of you with a bow in his hand and decide, for reasons he still cannot fully explain to either of us, that whatever is owed is not owed today. And I have watched my daughter warm her hands at your fire like a child who is not afraid, and none of that erases the canyon, and all of it is also true at the same time, and I have stopped believing that a person's whole life can be summed up as only one true thing when I have watched, with my own eyes, at least 2 true things sitting side by side in the same man for 3 months running." "What are you telling me?" "I am telling you that if you go in at a distance and take your chances alone, I will spend the rest of my life wondering whether I let a man die who had, whatever else was true about him, become the reason 3 of the people I love most in the world are still breathing," said Tabecho. "And I am too tired this year of all years to carry one more thing I did not have to carry, Go in with us. Stand where we stand. If it goes badly, it goes badly for all of us together, and I would rather that than the alternative you are offering me, which is to let you disappear alone into a story I will never fully know the end of." Sam did not answer for a long while. "That is not forgiveness," he said finally. "No," agreed Tabecho. "I told you it was not. It is something else, and I do not have a word for it yet, and I am not going to pretend to one before I have earned it honestly." They came into the agency at Fort Sill on the 9th of April, 1875, on foot mostly, 5 horses among what was by then 13 people, having gathered 2 more families along the final stretch who had heard the same word traveling the same grapevine and had reached, independently, the same exhausted arithmetic. What surrender looked like in the actual event was not a single dramatic moment. It was a long, slow, humiliating administrative afternoon, a line of people waiting to be counted by a clerk with a ledger, horses, what few remained, taken into a corral under guard, weapons stacked in a pile that grew through the day into something that made grown men who had never once shown fear in battle look away from it rather than watch. Rations of flour and bacon and coffee issued against names newly entered into a book that none of the people receiving them had chosen, and most could not read. Sam was neither shot nor arrested. He was, as he had predicted, very nearly forgotten. A clerk noted his return with a single line in a ledger. A lieutenant who had known him at Fort Griffin nodded to him once across a corral yard without any particular warmth, and that, for the United States Army, was the entire reckoning for 6 months of desertion in the aftermath of the largest single blow it had struck against the Southern Plains tribes in a generation. It was not the entire reckoning anywhere else, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so out loud that first exhausted night, camped in the new canvas tents issued at the agency, within sight of smoke from 100 other fires belonging to bands who had come in from every direction that spring, with the same arithmetic and the same grief, under a guard that watched everyone equally and understood almost nothing about any of them. Foxtail stood outside their tent for a long time that first night, looking north toward the Breaks country they had left, and Tabecho came and stood beside him without saying anything, because she had learned over a hard winter that her son's silences generally needed company rather than questions. "I keep thinking about the horses," he said finally. "I know. Not the 11 that were left, the others, the ones I heard from the rim and never saw." He was quiet a moment. "I do not think I am ever going to stop hearing that. Even when I am very old, even when I have grandchildren of my own and none of them know what I am hearing." "No," said Tabecho. "I do not think you are either. I hear it too some nights, though I was farther from it than you were. Then how do we live here?" He gestured at the tents, the corral, the guard, the whole new, terrible architecture of the rest of their lives. "How does anyone live inside the thing that did that to us?" Tabecho thought about it for a long time before she answered, because it was the truest and hardest question her son had ever asked her, and she did not want to give it a false shape simply because he was 12 and wanted an answer that fit inside a sentence. "I do not know that we live inside it exactly," she said finally. "I think we live alongside it, the way a person lives alongside a scar which does not go away and does not stop being a scar and does, eventually, stop being the only thing you can feel when you touch that part of yourself. I am not going to tell you it heals, because I do not think that is the honest word for what happens. I think what happens is that you build enough other things around it, enough mornings, enough small, ordinary tasks done well, enough people who are still here to do them with, that the scar stops being the whole shape of the day, even on days when it is still, somewhere underneath everything else, exactly as sore as it has always been." Foxtail did not say anything for a long time. "Is that what he is?" he said at last, and did not need to say the name. "One of the other things you are building around it." And Tabecho, who had not yet said any of this to anyone including herself in words that plain, found that her son had said it for her, and that it was, once said, simply and entirely true. "Yes," she said. I think that is exactly what he is. The first 2 years at the agency were the hardest kind of hard, because they were hard in a way that offered no clean crisis to survive and no clear enemy to measure yourself against, only a long gray accumulation of small daily losses that never stopped coming and never quite killed anyone outright either. Rations were short and came late and were sometimes bad when they came. Flour with weevils in it, beef driven so far and so thin that a family's week's allowance rendered down to almost nothing once the bone and gristle were accounted for. An agent named Howarth, and after him a man named Hunt, administered the post with the particular blend of genuine paternalist concern and total incomprehension that Tabecho came to recognize as the ordinary temperature of that whole system. Men who believed sincerely that they were saving people from themselves and who could not, most days, have named a single one of the actual skills or actual griefs of the people they were saving. There was a school, eventually, run by missionaries, and it took children for long stretches of the day and cut their hair when they arrived if it had not already been cut, and dressed them in stiff wool clothing that chafed in the heat, and punished them, in the early years especially, for speaking anything but English inside its walls. And Tabecho fought that battle the way she had fought every other battle of that decade, which was not by refusing outright. Refusal, she had learned, cost more than it won, and the ones who tried it lost their rations along with everything else, but by insisting every single evening when the children came home on an hour, sometimes two, of nothing but the old language, the old stories, Owl Woman's voice going on by the fire in the cadence Tabecho had heard her whole life, foxtail and blue flower required, not asked, to answer only in kind for that stretch of every evening, so that whatever the school took during the day, the fire took back every night, and neither child grew up mistaking English for the only language they had. They will hate this some evenings, Owl Woman said, the first month, watching Blue Flower sulk through a story she had heard 20 times already, in a language she was tired of being made to use. I know. Do it anyway. A child who hates the discipline at 7 is a woman who is grateful for it at 30. In my experience, though I grant you it is a long time to wait for gratitude, and you will not get an ounce of it in the meantime. Sam, for his part, found work as an interpreter and occasional scout for the agency itself, an irony that was not lost on anyone, least of all him, and that he addressed directly once in a council of elders that had gathered, as promised the previous spring, to finally take up the matter of what was owed for Palo Duro. The council met in October of 1875. 18 months after Standing in the Timber had ridden into their camp with a rifle raised, in a gathering of perhaps 30 elders and headmen from bands scattered across the whole agency, called specifically at Owl Woman's insistence, and with Tabecho's family standing as the party most directly affected, to decide, formally, what a Tonkawa scout who had guided the column to Palo Duro Canyon and had since spent a year in the actual physical service of the families his work had ruined was owed and owed to. It was not a trial in the sense the soldiers at the fort would have recognized one, and it was not a mercy either. It was something older and, Tabecho came to believe, considerably wiser than either, a room full of people who had themselves lost everything sitting in a circle to decide collectively and out loud what a debt like that could actually be paid with, given that the coin it was incurred in 1,000 horses, a way of living, children who had starved that winter and not all of whom had lived, could not be repaid in any literal sense by any single man, however long he worked or however sincerely he grieved. Standing in the Timber was there, older by 18 months and a great deal quieter than the last time Tabecho had seen him, and he spoke first, as the family with the freshest grievance had the right to. "My cousin is dead at Palo Duro," he said. "This man found the trail that let the soldiers reach him. I do not think there is a payment that changes that fact, and I have not come here today to ask for one, because I have had 18 months to sit with it, and I have concluded that no payment exists that would not simply be a lie both of us agreed to tell each other. I have come to say that fact plainly in front of this council, so that it is recorded, in the way our people record such things, in memory and in the mouths of people who were present, and so that it is never afterward said that this debt was forgotten rather than decided." "That is fair," said Owl Woman into the silence that followed. "Does anyone dispute that the fact should stand recorded exactly as he has said it?" No one did. Then Foxtail, 13 now, stood, which was itself a departure from how such councils ordinarily proceeded. A boy speaking among elders, and nobody stopped him, because word of what had happened at that fire 18 months before had traveled with the rest of the grapevine, and everyone present already half knew what he was going to say. "I lost horses at Palo Duro that my father had given me," he said. "I lost my father 9 days before that, in a different fight, for a different reason, and some nights I have let myself blame this man for both, even though I know the second one is not fairly his to carry. I stood in front of a rifle for him once, and I have spent a year and a half trying to understand why I did that, and I still do not fully understand it, but I know that whatever payment this council decides on, I do not want it to erase what I said that day, which was that it is not finished, but it is not finished by killing him, either. I want it recorded that I hold two things at once about this man, and that I am 13, and I do not expect anyone here to resolve that tension for me, because I have decided it is mine to carry unresolved for as long as it takes." Old Bull Elk, the eldest man present, then asked the question the whole council had gathered to answer. What does this camp propose the man owes, and to whom? And it was Tabecho who answered, having thought about almost nothing else for 18 months. "I do not think a debt like this is paid in a season or in a single decision made once and then finished with," she said. "I think it is paid, if it is paid at all, in the accumulation of years of a life lived in service of the very people it was incurred against, offered without any expectation that the accumulation will ever reach a total that balances the original loss, because it cannot, and known by the man paying it to be a debt that does not close, only continues to be honestly serviced. I am not asking this council to declare the debt paid. I am asking this council to recognize that the manner of payment, the manner, not the amount, because there is no amount, has been honest for a year, and to say so out loud, so that this man is not made to walk the rest of his life as a fugitive from a debt no council has ever formally acknowledged him to be paying honestly." The council deliberated for the better part of 2 hours out of earshot, and returned with words that Owl Woman relayed to the family afterward, and that Tabecho carried, in one form or another, for the rest of her life. This council finds that the debt from Palo Duro Canyon is real, is owed to the families and to the memory of those who died there and in its aftermath, and is not discharged, and cannot be discharged by any single act or any span of years, however long. This council also finds that the manner in which this man, Sam, called among his own people by a name this council does not have standing to use, has conducted himself in the 18 months since that debt was incurred, has been the conduct of a man honestly attempting an impossible repayment, and that such conduct, sustained without any claim to have completed the impossible, is the only kind of conduct this council has authority to recognize as good. This council does not forgive the debt because no council has that authority over a debt of this size. This council recognizes the manner of the man's continuing to try, and directs that this recognition, and not any word implying completion, be what is remembered and repeated when this matter is spoken of hereafter. "That is not forgiveness," Sam said to Tabecho that night, sitting outside their tent, the same words she had said to him 18 months before, in the same tone, testing them now from the other direction. "No," she agreed. "It never was going to be. I think you have understood from the very first fire that it was never going to be, and I think that is one of perhaps 3 things about you I have come to trust completely, the way your grandmother would put it, though I notice she still says perhaps 3 every time and has never once told me what the other 2 are. What is it then, if it is not forgiveness?" "I think it is permission," said Tabecho, "to go on living without either of us having to pretend the account is closed. I have found, over 18 months, that I did not actually want the account closed. I wanted it recorded honestly, and I wanted a way to keep living beside it. And today a council of 30 elders just told the whole agency, in the way that matters to our people, that both of those things are now true. They were married the following spring in April of 1876 by the simplest ceremony the agency and the old ways between them allowed, with Owl Woman presiding over the parts that were not the missionaries to preside over and refusing, flatly, to let the missionaries' parts come first. And Foxtail stood beside his mother through the whole of it with an expression that Tabecho, glancing at him once, read as neither joy nor grief but something harder one than either, the look of a boy who had decided deliberately to let two true things go on living in him side by side rather than forcing one to kill the other. Life at the agency, in the years that followed, settled into the particular rhythm of a people learning to survive inside a system built by people who had never once asked them how they wished to survive. There was farming, encouraged and sometimes forced, on allotments of ground that were not chosen for their goodness but for the ease of dividing them on a surveyor's map. And Sam, who had spent 9 years being paid by the army to read country, turned that same eye to reading which patches of the agency's poor land held water longest and which held frost off longest in spring. And their small plot, chosen with that knowledge, did better than most, though better than most on that ground in those years still meant a great many lean months. Blue Flower grew up mostly at the mission school, and mostly, despite Tabecho's best efforts, more comfortable in English than her mother would have liked, though the evening hour by the fire held, year after year, and by the time she was 15 she could move between the two languages and the two whole worlds they represented, with an ease that Tabecho watched with a complicated mixture of pride and grief. Pride that her daughter could survive in the world that was actually being built around her. Grief that survival required a fluency and erasure that Tabecho herself had never had to learn at that age. Foxtail did not go to the mission school past the age of 14. He apprenticed instead, over Tabecho's initial and considerable worry, to Sam directly, learning to track and read weather and read country with the same patient, unhurried thoroughness Sam had shown Standing Crow's infant's cough 4 years before. And by the time he was 17, he could find sign that most of the older men in the agency's remaining small hunting parties could not. A fact that everyone in the family noted, and no one, by unspoken agreement, ever said out loud in front of Standing in the Timbers family, out of a respect that had grown, over the years, into something like an uneasy, watchful, permanent peace between the two families, neither warm nor hostile, simply careful, the way two people who have stood across a serious matter from each other learn to be careful for the rest of their lives. In the spring of 1878, word went round the agency that the government had authorized what would be, though almost no one used that word for it until long afterward, the last true buffalo hunt any of them would ever be permitted to make. A limited excursion, escorted and closely watched, out onto what remained of the old range, in response to petitions from headmen across several agencies who had argued correctly that a single season's hunt, however small, would do more for their people's health and spirit than another year of agency beef. Sam was asked to guide the party on the strength of 9 years' reading of that exact country, and this time it was Foxtail, 19 now, who rode beside him as his second, the two of them out ahead of 40 hunters and their families for 11 days across ground that had, within Tabecho's own lifetime, held buffalo from horizon to horizon, and that now held, when they found anything at all, small scattered bands of a few dozen animals each, wary and thin and pressed into the poorest, most broken country left, the same kind of remnant band Sam had found for them in the desperate winter of 1874. They came home with meat. Not much. Not nearly what such a party would have taken in Tabecho's Mother's Day, but real meat, real hides, a real, if diminished, return of the old rhythm. And Foxtail, telling his mother and grandmother about it that first night home, was quiet for a long while before he said the thing that had clearly been sitting in him the whole ride back. "We found perhaps 200 animals in 11 days, across all that country," he said. My grandmother has told me there were days when she was young, when a single band crossing a single valley took longer to pass than a whole afternoon. I do not think there will be another hunt like this one. I think this was the last one, and I think everyone on that hunt knew it, and nobody said it out loud the whole 11 days, because saying it would have made it true a day sooner than it needed to be true. You are probably right, said Owl Woman, who was by then well past 70 and had grown in her final years, sparing with her words in a way that made the ones she still spent carry more weight than ever. I want to tell you something because I think you are old enough now to carry it, and because I did not tell your mother this at your age, and I have regretted the gap in her education ever since. The buffalo are not coming back. Not in your lifetime, and probably not in your children's. I have made peace, as much peace as an old woman gets to make with such a thing, with the fact that the last great herd I will ever see with my own eyes I already saw 20 years ago, and did not know at the time that I was seeing it for the last time. Nobody ever does know that at the time. That is, I think, the cruelest single fact about being alive as long as I have been alive. You are almost never told, in the moment, which time is the last time. You only find out afterward by counting the years that follow and never seeing it again. Then how do you bear it? Said Foxtail, echoing, though he did not know it, almost exactly the question he had asked his mother at the agency gate 3 years before. The same way you bear everything else that cannot be fixed and can only be lived alongside, said Owl Woman. You keep the memory precise, not soft, not sweetened, precise, the actual smell of the grass and the actual sound of 10,000 hooves, so that it does not decay into a story too smooth to be believed, and you hand that precise memory to whoever comes after you, and you let them carry it forward even into a world that has no buffalo in it at all, because a memory carried honestly is not nothing, even when it is not enough. And I have decided at my age that deciding it is not nothing is the only decision left available to me, and I have made it, and I am telling you to make it too, because you are going to need it a great deal longer than I will. Owl Woman died in the winter of 1881, in her sleep, without any particular drama, at an age the family recorded afterward as 68, though no one, including Owl Woman herself in her last years, was entirely certain the number was right, birth years on that plane having been kept for most of her generation by winters counted and remembered rather than any ledger, and ledgers being, in any case, precisely the kind of thing she had spent her whole life distrusting. Tabecho sat with her the last 3 days, and on the second to last night, with Blue Flower asleep against the lodge wall, and Foxtail keeping watch outside the way he had kept watch every night of that terrible winter 7 years before, Owl Woman said the thing that Tabecho understood, even as she was hearing it, that she would carry the rest of her own long life. I want to tell you what I saw that first night at the fire when he walked in with the rabbit, she said, her voice very thin but perfectly clear. I did not see a Tonkawa, and I did not see a scout, though I knew both those things about him within the first minute the same as everyone else did. I saw a man who had walked toward a fire full of people who had every right to kill him instead of away from it, because he had decided that being killed honestly was better than living the rest of his life having chosen, one more time, to disappear from a debt. I have watched a great many people in my life choose to disappear from their debts, granddaughter. It is the easier choice, almost always, and almost everyone takes it. I decided, that first night, watching him hold that rabbit out on a piece of bark with his hands shaking, that a man who would not take the easier choice, even once, in a moment when the harder choice might get him killed, was a man worth the risk of trusting a little further. I have not been wrong about very many people in my life. I was not wrong about him. You were not wrong about a great many things, said Tabecho, and could not, for a long moment, say anything else at all. I was wrong about a great many things too, said Owl Woman, with something that might, in a stronger voice, have been a laugh. I want that said plainly at the end, so that you do not build me into something smoother than I was, the way we do to the dead if we are not careful. I was wrong about the second dam site in 1868. I was wrong for 2 whole years about whether your husband's brother could be trusted with the winter cash, and I made his life harder than it needed to be over it. And I never told him I had been wrong, and I am telling you now instead, so that someone carries the correction forward even though I am the one who owes it. Grieve me honestly, if you are going to grieve me at all. Precise, the way I taught your son to keep the buffalo. Not softened. She died the following night, with the whole family around her, and Tabecho kept that instruction for the rest of her own life, telling her grandchildren, decades later, not a smoothed story of a wise old woman who was never wrong, but the whole difficult, particular, precisely remembered shape of a woman who had been wrong about specific things in specific years and had said so herself, at the end, because she had judged that the precise truth was worth more carried forward than any comfortable story would have been. The years that followed Owl Woman's death were not easy years. No year at that agency in that decade was an easy year, but they were, for the first time since October of 1874, years that Tabecho experienced as something other than a continuous emergency, and she noticed the change, the way a person notices the absence of a pain they had stopped expecting to ever stop feeling. Sam's standing at the agency shifted slowly over that decade, from tolerated outsider to something closer to a fixture, not because the old grief around him had dissolved, it had not, and both he and Tabecho understood by then that it never would, not fully, not for standing in the Timbers family, and not, some nights, for Foxtail either, but because a decade of consistent, unspectacular, honest work had done what the council had said it would do, which was accumulate without ever claiming to add up to a total. He interpreted at councils where Comanche, Kiowa, and English all needed to be understood in the same room. He doctored, informally, half the agency's children through one outbreak of measles and two of whooping cough, using the same patient half-learned mixture of remedies he had used on Standing Crow's infant in December of 1874. He taught alongside Foxtail a younger generation of boys to track and read weather in a country that had less and less each year left to track, and he grew old the way Owl Woman had grown old, which was to say precisely, without softening the record, even in his own telling of it. He told his and Tabecho's grandchildren in later years the whole of what had happened at Palo Duro Canyon in the same plain, unflinching language he had used at the fire that first December night, and he told them every single time that the council's findings stood not forgiven, only honestly serviced, and that they were not to let anyone, including their own grandfather, tell the story any softer than that. "Why do you tell it that way?" his granddaughter Mary asked him once, perhaps 12 years old, sometime in the middle 1890s, on an evening when he had told the story for what must have been the 100th time in her hearing. "Everyone else's grandfather tells stories where the grandfather is the hero, because a story where I am the hero is a story that lets you stop thinking about the actual dead horses and the actual dead men," said Sam, "and I have decided a long time ago that I would rather be remembered honestly as a complicated man who did one great harm and spent the rest of his life trying, imperfectly, to answer for it than be remembered comfortably as a hero, because the second kind of memory does no good to anyone except the man being remembered, and I'm no longer very interested at my age in doing myself favors at the expense of the truth." Foxtail married in 1883 a Kiowa woman named Little Bear Woman from a family with no direct connection to Palo Duro, and settled on an allotment a few miles from his mother's, and it was, everyone in the family privately agreed without ever saying it in front of him, a relief to watch him build something of his own that was not shadowed, every single day, by the events of his 13th year, though the shadow never fully left him either. He named his first son, born in 1885, after Black Otter, and told the boy, from the time he was old enough to understand it, the whole precise story of his grandfather's death on the Sweetwater, and his mother's arithmetic of 11 horses, and his own choice, at 12, to stand in front of a rifle for reasons he still, 40 years later, was never entirely able to explain to his own satisfaction. Blue Flower married later in 1889 a young Comanche man who worked, of all things, for the agency's small cattle operation and moved into a life that looked, on its surface, almost entirely different from her mother's. More English spoken in her house than Comanche most days. A framed photograph on the wall in the style the missionaries favored. Children who went further through the mission school than either of their parents had, and Tabecho watched that difference for years with the same complicated grief and pride she had felt watching her daughter grow up fluent in two worlds, and came eventually to a kind of peace with it that she articulated to Sam late one night in terms he never forgot, and repeated afterward to their grandchildren as one of the truest things his wife ever said to him. "I used to think my daughter was disappearing into their world," Tabecho said. "I have decided, watching her for 20 years, that I was wrong about the shape of it. She is not disappearing. She is doing what water does when a dam is put across its path, finding every crack and every low place and continuing to move through country that was built specifically to stop it, and coming out somewhere on the other side still recognizably itself, still moving in the direction it always meant to move, only by a route nobody who built the dam ever anticipated or could fully see. I do not know if that is a comfort or simply a description. I have decided at my age that a true description is sometimes the only comfort actually available, and I have stopped asking for more than that." Sam died in the winter of 1901 of a lung sickness that took most of a season to finish its work, and he was, to the last, precise about his own account, exactly as he had insisted his grandchildren be precise about it. "I want it said the same way at my grave that it was said the first night at the fire," he told Tabecho a week before the end, his breath already coming hard, not softer. "I have watched over 26 years a great many people try to make my story softer for me out of kindness, and I have refused it every time. And I am asking you at the very end to refuse it on my behalf when I am no longer able to refuse it myself. Tell them what happened at the canyon. Tell them what the council found. Tell them I served an impossible debt for 26 years and never once claimed to have finished paying it, because I had not, and a man does not get to finish an account like that simply by dying, whatever the dying feels like from the inside. I will tell it exactly that way," said Tabecho, "for as long as I am alive to tell anything at all." "Then I am not afraid," said Sam, and that was, very nearly, the last full sentence he said to her, though he lived 4 more days after it, mostly asleep, and Tabecho sat beside him through all 4 of those days the way she had once sat beside Owl Woman, keeping the memory precise even as it was still being made, because she had learned from the best teacher she ever had that precision was the only gift left to give a person at the very end, and that it was, against every instinct that wanted to soften it, actually the larger gift. Tabecho lived 22 years past him, long enough to see the century turn, long enough to see her grandson Black Otter, named for the grandfather he never met, grow into a man who farmed his own allotment and sat occasionally on the tribal council that had by then taken on new and different fights than the ones his grandmother had fought. Fights over land patents and lease income and the endless erosions of a policy that took a little more of the base of a people's life with every new administration, and long enough to see Blue Flower's children grow up speaking almost no Comanche at all, a fact that grieved her in a way she never fully resolved, and that she made a point in her last years of not pretending had resolved. She told the whole story: the horses, the fire, the rabbit on the bark, the rifle at the camp's edge, the council of 30 elders, the 26 years of an account that never closed, many times over those 22 years, to grandchildren, and eventually to a few great-grandchildren, and she told it every time, the way Sam had asked her to tell it and the way Owl Woman had taught her to tell everything. Precise, not softened, the actual number of horses and the actual name of the man who guided the column and the actual finding of the actual council, because she had come to believe, by the end of her own long life, that a story told soft enough to be comfortable was a story that had already started to stop being true. In the last spring of her life, In 1923, nearly 80 years old by her own best reckoning, she sat with her granddaughter, Mary's youngest daughter, a girl of 9 named for no one in particular, who had asked her, the way children eventually always did, whether she had been afraid that first night when the man with the government boots walked into the firelight. "I was afraid of a great many things that year," Tabecho told her. "I was afraid of the cold and afraid of the hunger and afraid most nights that I would wake up and find one of you not breathing, though you were not born yet, and none of your particular faces existed for me to fear for specifically. I feared for the shape of you before I knew what any of you would look like. I was not especially afraid of him. I want you to understand why, because I think it is the only useful thing I have to tell you about that whole terrible year. More useful than the cold or the hunger or the number of horses, which you already know by heart because I have made you learn them. Why weren't you afraid of him? Because a person who is willing to walk toward the consequence of what he has done instead of away from it has already told you the most important thing there is to know about him before he has said a single word," said Tabecho. "Everything else, what he had done, what he had been, what he owed and could never fully pay, I learned afterward, over years, the slow way, the only honest way there is to learn a person. But that first fact, that he came toward the fire instead of away from it, I knew in the first 4 seconds, and I built the rest of my trust on top of that fact very slowly, the way you build a lodge on ground you have tested first for how well it holds weight, and it held weight, that ground, for 26 years, and when it finally gave way, it was only because he died, which is the one kind of giving way that ground is eventually always going to do, no matter how well it was tested." The girl was quiet for a while, turning that over the way children do, taking some of it and setting the rest aside for a year she had not reached yet. "Do you miss him?" "Every day," said Tabecho. "I do not tell you that to make you sad. I tell you because I think you should grow up knowing that missing someone every day for 22 years and still getting up every morning to do the ordinary work of a life are not two different things fighting each other. They are the same thing, done at the same time, by the same tired, grateful, unresolved person, and I have found, at the end of a long life, that this is simply what love turns into once it has been tested by enough winters. It does not get smaller, it gets quieter, and it gets less dramatic, and it starts sharing space every single day with the ordinary bread and the ordinary weather and the ordinary work of raising the next ones. And if anyone ever tells you that this is love getting weaker, do not believe them. It is love getting old enough to stop needing an audience." Tabecho died in November of 1923 in the same season. By coincidence, she would have found satisfying had she lived to notice it, as the great flooding dam agreements far to the north that some travelers had begun bringing word of. Other rivers, other rice fields, other families doing the same terrible arithmetic she had once done with horses and buffalo. A whole continent's worth of the same story told in 100 different rivers and 100 different winters, none of them knowing about the others. All of them, in the end, keeping the same kind of precise, unsoftened memory alive by the same method, an old woman by a fire, telling a child a story she has told 100 times before, in the exact words, on purpose, because somebody is going to need to say it again long after she is not there to say it herself. She was buried beside Sam, on the allotment they had built together out of a country that had given them almost nothing willingly, and Black Otter, the grandson, 38 years old that autumn, with children of his own by then, stood at both graves together for a long time before he spoke, and what he said, which his own daughter repeated for the rest of her life whenever anyone asked her about the family's beginning, was this: they did not forgive each other for everything. They told me that themselves, more than once, so that I would never mistake what happened here for a story about forgiveness, which is not, it turns out, the hardest or the most honest thing two people can do for each other. What they did instead was harder and lasted longer. They kept an account open honestly for 26 years and never once pretended it was closed, and built an entire family and an entire second life on the strength of an account that never closed, which I have come to believe is the actual bravest thing either of them ever did. Braver than the fire that first night. Braver than the rifle at the camp's edge. Braver than any single dramatic moment in the whole long story. Staying and continuing to try for 26 years on a debt you know you will never finish paying. That is the part nobody puts in a song, and it is the part I want remembered because it is the part that is actually true and because it is the part that raised me.